There you go.
All right. Hey, I'm Tamsen Webster, author of Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. And here's the best piece of advice I ever got. It is that you don't get to choose other people's interpretations of you. You only get to choose the experiences you offer.
Ooh, that's really good.
That was
I like
good.
that, Tamsin.
One of
That's
my
really good.
favorite bosses is a lovely, wonderful, incredible woman named Maya Dennis. And she was my boss and my stint working at an advertising agency here in the Boston area, and she was fabulous. And that advice has stuck with me ever since.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, right? Experiences is where it's at. I mean, that's why, right? That's why we have to find our red thread. So I got two of
That's
these here. So,
right.
right? And that's why. So with that, hey folks, so if you're listening and you got a great comment, you're super smart, leave a comment. I'm going to pop the book up. When you see the book, leave a comment. If you're nice and you're smart and you add value, then I'll give you a book. And if you just ask a good question, maybe I'll give you a book, or we'll see at the end of the
There is a book
show.
available to be given by
There is
Phil
one
to
book. That's right,
someone.
one
So
book.
that's exciting.
Yeah,
Yes.
that is
Yes.
exciting.
Yes.
So, Tamsin,
So
congratulations, first of all, on your book.
thank you,
That
sir.
is awesome. I'm super happy for you. You said you worked on it a couple days, so that's
Couple
really
days.
awesome. Or a
Ah,
couple years. Some of the one of
yeah,
those,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think the actual
yeah.
deep writing of it was very much my pandemic project. I had started it and allowed myself to just kind of listen to every internal troll there was about like why it needed to be different or why I needed to wait longer to write it. But then last year, I just set up a kind of a Zoom room for anybody else who was also writing. And I
That's
just told
right.
myself I would do 20 minutes, at least 20 minutes a day. And hey, look at that. At the end of it all, I had a book.
Woo! That's really
Woo!
good. And not just a book, a really good book, by the
Thank you,
way.
sir.
It's a really helpful book. We are talking in the green room about how you structured it. So take us through the thoughts that go into structuring a book about finding basically your book, right? Find your
Yeah,
idea, find
exactly.
your big
Yeah.
stuff.
It's
Talk to us
very
about that.
meta. I don't recommend writing a book about, well, in one way I do, in one way I don't. Was if it's difficult to write a book about how to think through structure and articulate ideas, um, when that is also the subject of the book, because me being who I am, I couldn't follow a different process than the one I was writing about to write the book. So it just meant that in one way that meant that there were no easy outs for me. There wasn't any like, well, I'm just gonna write this chapter without thinking through exactly what I'm going to say and what the actual big idea is of this chapter is going to be. But at the same time, I'd say that was the positive of it as well, because it meant that the book it meant that I just really needed to do the extra work to make sure it was as tight and clean, clear, and as good as I wanted it to be. So, yeah. So it's structured along, along the process that it's about.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, you said something there that's really important that I think a lot of aspiring authors forget about, and that is they might come up with a catchy headline that they write first, and then they come up with what's in there, as opposed to the other way, and finding, crafting, if you will, your red thread. So talk to me about that, Tamsin. How do you find the big idea in each chapter? Take us through your process there.
Sure. So, I mean, it could probably help to define what I mean by the red thread. And what I mean by the red thread is it is the story that your brain builds to connect a question and answer, an issue and idea, a problem and solution. Our brains do this anyway, by the way. We are constantly kind of making up stories, not once upon a time stories, but real explanations to say, oh, these two things happened. Here's why they're connected. And so the big idea of the book is that we can, if you can put your idea into that story-like framework, people are going to more quickly understand it and more quickly see the power in it. So that meant that I was going through the book. There's obviously the red thread of the book, right? And the red thread of the book can be summarized that, the best way to make your ideas irresistible is to build the stories that people will tell themselves about it. And then from there, it was, okay, what are the steps to doing that? And for me, it was following the steps that I use with my own clients. So this is absolutely, the book walks through the same process I use with my clients. And as I was thinking through each of those steps, so starting, for instance, with deciding like, where are we going to use this message? Who is it for? What's the outcome going to be? when I needed to stop and figure out, okay, I know what the step is, but why is this the step? Why is it important? I needed to go back and build that red thread, build that kind of quick story, that explanation about, all right, well, how does this particular step help you build a story that people will tell themselves? And so I just did that for each chapter, really starting from, each chapter started from the same point of, all right, you're trying to build a story that people will tell themselves. Okay, all right, what's the thing that's getting in the way? What's a piece of information that makes that problem impossible to ignore? What is the change in thinking or behavior that this particular chapter represents? And then what are the actions that I am asking you to take in each chapter so that you can get through that particular step of the red thread? So it really was just kind of finding and following this process of the red thread over and over and over again, so that I had kind of a bunch of little red threads that fit into this big arc of the book.
Awesome. That's beautiful. And it works really well. I mean,
Thanks.
Each chapter is somewhat standalone and yet obviously super connected, which is what I love about it. But let's back up a little bit here and talk about your journey, because I think that's very fascinating to folks. You say in the acknowledgments that you credit a lot of who you are with being a Weight Watchers leader.
That's 100%
Talk to me
true.
about that, Tamsen.
Yes. So 22 years ago now, I lost the last of 50 pounds that I have maintained for those 22 years and 2 children. And I did that following the Weight Watchers program. And at the time, I was so grateful for the shifts in thinking and behavior that helped me make, that I wanted to pay that forward. And so I moonlighted for 15 years working for Weight Watchers, evenings, weekends, mornings, as what's known as a leader. And my job as a leader was to not only kind of check in with everybody every week to see how they were doing towards their health goals, but talk about a topic. And so, Phil, you and I are both speakers. I will also tell you this is where I got all of my speaking chops, because after 13 years at the front of the room, it was sometimes up to 5 times a week, a different topic every week, 30 to 45 minutes. I did the math one time and it was 3,000 presentations, all with the aim of changing how someone thought or behaved afterwards, so that they could take, this idea, turn it into an action and have it become a habit. And I learned a lot about what works and what doesn't when it comes not only to just presenting information, but particularly what is required for someone to really hear something, understand it, and take on an idea as their own, which is the only way to make an action long-term, the only way to turn an action into long-term change. But it was a great challenge. And I always saw it as my kind of lab of really figuring out, how do you make things interesting? How do you make it engaging to people? How do you make it understandable? And then for my own sanity, how do you find just nearly infinite ways to talk about what I joke was probably only about 12 topics. But I also held myself to the standard of never repeating the same meeting twice, at least week to week. I mean, within a week, I do the same one, but just everything from how to present, how to manage question and answer, how to talk with people, how to help inspire change, what you couldn't do as far as change goes. All of that I attribute to my time at Weight Watchers.
Wow. 3,000 different speeches though. Holy crap. 100%. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's so interesting. A lot of the best speakers, the best storytellers that I've talked to started out with something like that. And maybe not Weight Watchers, right? But Skill Path or something else where they're delivering a message that maybe is kind of pre-boxed, if you will, but your own way, in your own style. So that's really cool. Wow, that makes a lot of sense then why you're so awesome at storytelling. But curation, though, you moved from that, and not immediately, right? But you moved into the curation of ideas. You're TEDx Cambridge, the curator of TEDx. So talk to us about what that entails and how that helps people find their red thread.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm not exclusively, that's not my exclusive role there. So I need to be super clear about that. But for the years that I was the executive producer, and now again that I've returned as the idea strategist, I am part of the, I'm part of the 2-person team really that decides this person is going to go on stage or this one is not. And that became after, they overlapped a little bit. TEDx and Weight Watchers overlapped a little bit, but when I decided to stop doing Weight Watchers as a leader and started doing TEDx Cambridge, that replaced the lab situation for me. That became a new place to experiment, and I had to do that in particular because up until that point, I was always the person making those statements, making those messages, coming up with those ideas and presenting them. And when it came to TEDx Cambridge, it was somebody else who was making those ideas and somebody else who had to present those pieces of information and make those and take those steps.
Wow. That's so interesting, right? That you could help, from developing your own to helping others craft theirs, to helping other people, I guess, maybe unlock them, but still testing, still finding that out. And yet, do you think that your red thread, even though maybe you didn't have it defined, Tamsen, was always present? In the structure, or did you play with the structure as well, and then you just decided on it? How does that work?
So it was yes to all of that. So here's kind of what happened. So I think in the early days when I first started with TEDx Cambridge, I was actually working for a different company, and they had a wonderful approach to understanding how to kind of flip the lens around on messages. A great company called Oratium. And the real lesson that I learned for them was to start thinking about any presentation, any message, really through the eyes of the audience and not through the eyes of you, the speaker. And that was really important. They also did a lot of great work on helping you understand what do people need to believe before they will take action. But when I started my own business about 5 years ago and decided to kind of branch off from Oratium, I needed to come up with my own intellectual property, like entirely from scratch. And so it wasn't so much that up until that point, I had like the structure of goal, problem, truth, change, action in my head. I didn't do that. But once I researched and found that structure, I realized in a lot of ways, that's what all of us do. Because what I wanted to understand was and a lot of this again goes back to Weight Watchers, that because of all the years that I spent at Weight Watchers, just to make myself a better leader, I did a huge amount of research just around motivation, around change, around persuasion, around communication, around how we make decisions, all of that. And so I had all of that in the back of my head, plus the teachings from Oratium. And I was like, okay, I need to make this as simple as possible, and it has to be as rigorous as possible, because at TEDx Cambridge, these are Harvard, MIT doctorates. Like they are a tough audience, and these folks have been writing books and writing papers and teaching classes for years and years and years. And if I'm going to come in and be like, no, actually, you need to flip that on its head, like it had to be rock solid. And as close to as I could get without being a doctorate myself, to being kind of that rigorous in its approach. So it really started with saying, okay, well, how, one of the things I knew from doing all that research before was this idea about how we make sense of information out of story. And so I really started to go there. And so I knew that piece. And then I also was facing this problem that not only myself, but a lot of the folks I was working with TEDx Cambridge did not consider themselves to be natural or good storytellers. So here was this tension. Everyone's like, oh, you've got to tell stories. That's how we make sense of information. And I'm like, I am crap at story. And I'm not comfortable telling stories. So I was like, well, there's got to be how do you actually build one? Because maybe if we can figure out how you build a story, like truly build a story, then I can get some insight in how do our brains do it. And that was really the process of saying, okay, I'm going to look at what are the conventions of stories that are out there. Like, what do all stories have? Not just the hero myth, not just, but what conventions do all stories have that create the transformation that all stories are about? And do they map over to things that the brain uses to make sense of information? And it turns out that it does. And while I don't have the primary research that says that like these are actually the 5 ways, I do have now 5 years of testing this and on hundreds of people at this point and hundreds of organizations to say, yeah, actually, if you can include these 5 elements in how you talk about any idea, then your idea will make sense because you're supplying the story structure that somebody's brain is looking for anyway.
Wow. Wow. So you broke that down. You gave us 5 ways there. I just want to recap them for folks that are listening because you hit them pretty quick. Goal, problem, truth, change, and action. And if you get a copy of the book, right, of Find Your Red Thread, which I've got 2 of, if you're listening, thinking, hey, I want a copy, buy one, but you can also win one. Leave a comment, right? Let us know that you're listening, that you're watching. Those are the 5 simple truths, if you will, of a great story. So, Tamsen, which one do you find that most people leave out the most often in the stories that they have?
Okay, it's the one that they leave out the most often is the truth, and followed very closely behind by the second part of the problem. So, the truth one, here's the thing. A lot of us have been taught well that if you're going to present a solution, you also need to present a problem. And that's where a lot of people stop. And there's a really simple way to demonstrate how that actually isn't enough. And it's an analogy that other folks have used, but it's effective. And that's like, okay, imagine you go into a doctor for a checkup. Let's say it's a new doctor. They've never examined you before. But they walk into the room and they just kind of look at you. And the first thing out of their mouths is, so are you ready to schedule the surgery? And you're probably not going to be, right? And that's the equivalent of just saying, hey, you need to do this without giving any reason why. So most of us have learned that you need to present a problem. And that's true because, if you don't even know what the surgery is for, like you're certainly not going to be willing to do it. But so you can do it this way. You can say, okay, let's say I do this. I walk in and I say, hey, there's a spot on your back. Are you ready to schedule the surgery? So now you know why it's happening, but you still haven't been convinced that there's, that you have to take this action because there isn't something that is kind of inarguable about that problem that makes that change necessary. And so this is what I call a truth because it's what happens in Once Upon a Time stories that's known as the moment of truth. I mean, every story has this. And I would say actually, even though every story has this, every other articulation of story structure that I've seen, kind of fill in the blanks, doesn't actually include this moment where someone goes, oh, that's true. And if that's true, then I either have to give up what I want, unbelieve something that I believe, both of which are highly unlikely, by the way, or I have to think or do something different than I'm doing right now. So this truth piece would be, in the case of my analogy, something like, okay, Phil, you've got a spot on your back. Based on what I'm seeing, right? It's the kind of thing that we would probably need to operate on. I know you're probably not ready for surgery yet, but would you be open to talking about some of the options? Like now you've heard something about that makes that a problem possible to ignore. And so I would say that really, that connective tissue between a problem and solution, that's something that isn't, I think the thing that I see people do instead is to say, here's why the action is awesome, right? So we're trying to like problem, solution, and here's the benefit, helpful. But if somebody hasn't been convinced that your answer is the only answer to their question and to their problem, they're not going to do that. So that truth is the piece that most people miss.
Okay, so the only answer, or would the best answer also be an option there? Or does it have to be the only answer?
Well, I mean, I think you want it to feel like it's the only answer that makes intuitive and intellectual sense to people. One of the things I learned at Weight Watchers, one of the things I say in the book itself is that you can't actually create change. You can't make someone change, not long term. Can you make someone take an action? Absolutely. Can you make them keep taking it willingly on their own for the long term? Nope. Not unless you make it make both emotional and intelligent sense to them. And so when you're presenting an option and, your idea, because I see an idea as being an answer to a question, you want to create it so that based on what that person wants and what they believe, you want them to feel like that's the best answer for them. And is it going to be the only one? No. But that's as good as you can make it. You can only create the conditions for change. You can't create change itself. And creating that moment of truth, that moment where somebody really has to decide, do I actually really want this thing that I thought I wanted? Am I going to deny a thing that I would otherwise have agreed to be true? Or am I open to changing my perspective on this so that maybe I could suddenly see things a little bit differently and then see a different path out? Well, yeah, okay. But that moment is necessary in order for that click, that kind of perma click to happen. Otherwise, people will kind of give it a try. And if if it works out for them long term, then they usually will go back and create a story about why it made sense. But I'm all about efficiency. Like from reading the book that I love Proverbs, and there's Proverbs, sprinkled throughout. A stitch in time saves 9 as far as I'm concerned. And why not just supply that story at the beginning rather than take your chances that maybe someone will convince themselves that this was actually the right decision.
Wow. I love what you said there. Not only is the right decision only, but best answer for them.
Yeah.
Is something you said that really resonates in my head. And I hear that. I'm like, right. That if it's the best interest, if it's the best answer for them and it's all about them,
correct,
we have an opportunity then to persuade them, as opposed to, you know what, it benefited me and you should do this too, right? Benefit stacking is really tough. So I really dig that. And that's a great way to, to really think about any story, any conversation that we have. If we can find the best answer for the other people, and then connect that through with a red thread based around, if it's a sales presentation or whether it's a speech or whether it's training or whatever it is, if we can weave that through, we have an opportunity there to actually provide some influential change, if you will, right? To get them closer.
Yeah, and change that isn't manipulative. And so it's for any of us who spend time talking about persuasion and influence, which all of this really comes down to. That's a decision that everybody has to make at some point about where that bright line that they will not cross lies. And again, back to Weight Watchers, it's one of those things where there wasn't an option to manipulate people into that just makes me ick. But B, if my goal was to help people make a long-term, if not permanent change, you cannot manipulate people into a permanent change. You just can't. You can only lead them to it. And someone will only do something long-term if they believe that it aligns with how they see the world and if it aligns with how they see themselves. So the best you can do is to understand the people that you're talking to, the point where you are and valuing who they are, to the point where you're able to, and that you at least try to see your idea through their lens, because that's the case that you need to build, not your case for your idea. You already know why it's awesome. That's easy for you to say why it's great. It's a lot harder to say why somebody who is a skeptic or someone who doesn't know anything about it would be convinced that it's great. But we all know that it requires something else than just being told that there's benefit to doing something. Because if we did that, there's a million things that each of us would do, right? And there's a million reasons why we have come up with ourselves, why we don't do them. And so that's where it really comes down to, I just believe that so passionately that you can't create change. You can only create the conditions for it. And to do that ethically, the only way that you can do that is to do it from the perspective of the person that you're talking to. And so that you're saying, based on what you want, based on what you believe, here's why I believe this is the right thing for you. And you can disagree. You should disagree if I've got it wrong. But anything else is trying to get someone to want something they don't want, or to believe something that they don't fundamentally believe, or to make them feel wrong about any of that. And making somebody feel wrong about how they've lived their life to this point is usually a surefire way of them getting them to reject anything that you're about to say afterwards.
Definitely. Wow. Well, so in the book, you say one of the most important conditions for change is that a person feels in control of themselves, their lives, or their choices. And I think
Yep.
that supports what you just said there, because we change for our own reasons. We don't change because someone else told us to, no matter how great the story is, no matter
Right.
how compelling the reason might be to us. If it isn't our own idea, well, we're not going to change. So how do we get started with that, Tamsen? Obviously, right, we should go to redthreadbook.com and get a copy of the book, right? But if we're to get started along this path and maybe
Yep.
start exploring how we do this, what's a great way to get started?
Great way to get started is with the goal, which is that first piece of the red thread, because that's where the story starts. Any great story starts the moment we know what somebody wants. We lead in once we can sense that somebody wants something that they don't have, and if that person wants something that we don't have, then we are super interested in it. So that's the reason why, if you're just starting to think about this, one of the first places to start is to say, what question is my audience, whatever they may be, whoever they may be, what question is my audience asking that they haven't yet answered for themselves, and for which my idea is an answer? Because sometimes people say, okay, the book's called How to Make Big Ideas Irresistible, make your big idea irresistible. What's a big idea? And to me, a big idea is any idea that answers a question that people haven't answered for themselves yet. And so that's where I would suggest that people start, is what is a question? What question does your idea answer that people haven't answered for themselves yet? Because that flipping it around, right? That allows you to say, not just like, here's the question that it should answer, here's the question they should be asking, but what question are they actually asking right now? And that's really the first step to putting yourself in your audience's shoes and to building their case for your idea.
Wow. That is fantastic, Tamsen. Thank you for that. Absolutely. Put yourself in the audience's shoes, see from their perspective, and find out, what are they asking that they haven't already answered for themselves, that maybe your idea can answer for it. That is an awesome red thread. So folks, if you're listening, if you're watching, get your own copy at Find Your Red Thread at redthreadbook.com. Go to Amazon. You get some great bonuses, though, if you go to Tamsen's site. And if you're listening, if you're watching, and you're like, hey, I don't know about this. Well, if you want to win a copy of the book, you can just leave a comment or send me a message, phil@philgerbishek.com, or wherever you are. Reach out and let me know, like, what do you think about all this stuff? What are you thinking? If it's a good question or a good story yourself, well, maybe I'll get you a copy of the book. So, Tamsen, I'm so grateful that you spent some time with me today. I love your book, and you are just the best. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. My pleasure.
Well, you helped me so much 5 years ago. We were talking about this in the green room, where you and I went to our first. Well, you were at my first National Speakers Association Influence Conference, and you were such a lovely human and have continued to be. So thank you so much for all your help and support.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure. We got a couple folks on. Lisa Gonke says, 2 wonderful people. Thank you, Lisa and Denise Yon. Denise is awesome. She's got some great books too. So everyone watching, listening, paying attention, go find your red thread. Go to redthreadbook.com. Get to know my friend Tamsen Webster just a little better.
Yes, Kyle is complimenting our glasses, Phil. So
there we go. Kyle, you are the bomb, man. Thanks, buddy. Yep, we got the on fleek here with the glasses. I got the red ones for Tamsen, and Tamsen's got her fancy ones for me.
That's right.
Glad that you're here.
Wild and crazy for my friend Phil.
That's it. Good times. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.